Hey, everybody. Welcome to Moment of Clarity. Thanks for joining me. Ecuador looked in the face of imperialism and said, nah, we're good. No thanks. Go fuck yourselves. Pretty cool what happened yesterday in the election. It's not over yet. There is a runoff. But I'm going to have Ollie Vargas here to speak to us, to break it down for us. Great journalist. I've been following his stuff for a while now on Twitter, and you're going to really like hearing from him. So he will be here in a few minutes. Don't miss that. But yeah, please take a second to share this to let people know that we're hanging out here. And thanks to all of you saying hi. Someone, who was it? Stevie D's asked me to say something about Clyde Kerr III. And this is a pretty crazy story. This a black sheriff's deputy in Louisiana. Actually, I think I can share the article here with you. Black sheriff deputy said he was calling out systemic racism. Said the system he was a part of caused brutality, police brutality, institutionalized racism, and unfortunately, he then killed himself. But even just the first part before his death is pretty unheard of. There are not many police officers, current or former, that speak out publicly about what is a very obvious problem in this country, which is systemic racism. But it is a racism that they are in charge of enforcing. You know, they are the fist of the racist state. And that just because many of them are people of color does not mean it's not racist. And in fact, I've heard anecdotally that, you know, black cops are often, or at least sometimes, the most violent because they're kind of trying to prove to a racist system of law enforcement, their higher ups and their partners and everything, that they are capable of instituting a racist police state. And so they try and prove themselves by being almost more brutal than the white cops. But anyway, obviously sad that he killed himself, but it is very rare for police officers to come forward and admit that what they're a part of, you know, there's just a massive amount of cognitive dissonance there to, you know, be a part of that. It's where your income's coming from. It's what you've devoted yourself to doing as a career, and then to realize how fucked it is and to turn against it. The police officer I've probably spoken to the most and had on Redacted tonight is Officer Ray Lewis, former captain in Philadelphia. And I met him down at Occupy in the days of Occupy. Very outspoken police officer about the racism, about how they're defending, you know, police officers are defending the corporate state by crushing protests, etc. And anyway, he said in one of my interviews, I said, you know, have you gotten a lot of support from other police officers? There's got to be some out there that support not crushing protesters, not brutalizing people, not arresting peaceful protesters. And he said, you know, I thought when I first came out that I would get a lot of support, maybe not from active duty police officers, but at least from veterans, former police officers. And he said it was just crickets. He said some of them would say off the record, I support what you're doing. But he said, he either said no one or almost no one came forward to stand with him at these protests, asking the police officers to not harm peaceful protesters and to not be a part of a brutal state that is crushing dissent. Anyway, go read that article, you know, learn about, what's his name again? Clyde Kerr III. Very, very fascinating story with a sad ending. But I want to get to what just happened in Ecuador. So they had an election. Lenin Moreno decided he's not running, that he wasn't going to run for re-election. And Lenin Moreno in Ecuador was the kind of Trojan horse neoliberal piece of garbage who followed in the footsteps of Correa. I believe he was his vice president. And everybody thought he was going to be a lot like Correa as a leader of Ecuador. And instead, he immediately pulled an about face, allowed the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, back into the country. Most of you know the IMF's business model is to offer, basically debt to countries, offer to do things to countries, offer billions of dollars to countries, and then they have that country under their thumbs. They can control them. They can tell them what to do. They can tell them how to behave and set up their policies. They can create austerity, which crushes average and poor people. And anyway, he brings IMF back into the country, which if you're in Ecuador and you're a person in Ecuador, you're like, why the fuck? We worked so hard to get rid of the IMF, to get them off our backs so that we weren't delivering like our entire GDP to a banking central bankers every year rather than helping the people in our country. And then he flips and brings them back into the country. I believe the number was like $4 billion or something. And it was within weeks of when he also flipped and gave Julian Assange up from the Ecuadorian embassy, told the British authorities, yeah, come on in, ignore our sovereignty, ignore the fact that you legally, under international law, cannot come into this embassy. Fuck all that. Come and get Julian Assange. I'm sure you'll treat him great. I'm sure he's going to have a good old time in Belmarsh prison. What could go wrong? Because he is such a horrible human being for publishing the truth, isn't he? And anyway, Julian Assange is arrested, as you know. He's now been in Belmarsh prison for over 2 years. And that was thanks to Lenin Moreno. So anyway, he wasn't running. Another banker, neoliberal goon, ran. And anyway, Ollie will give us more of the details. But it seems like it was a pretty impressive win last night for the socialist candidate, although there will still be a runoff. But rather than me sounding mildly informed, let's get someone who's really informed in here. Please welcome Ollie Vargas.
Hey, yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. Thanks for taking the time. I'm a big fan of your work. I really enjoyed it on following you on Twitter. You do such excellent journalism, and I just wanted to bring you on to kind of give the background and the details of what has happened in the Ecuadorian election. Sounds like a pretty impressive night.
Yeah, so the elections were on Sunday. And in the first round, the largest party is the left-wing party, belonging to the former president Rafael Correa, who was part of sort of the first wave of Latin American presidents who rejected the US model, expelled US military bases, nationalized large sections of the economy, and then delivered a huge amount of growth. There's a huge amount of poverty reduction in Ecuador, like in Bolivia and other places. There was around a 50% reduction in poverty. So people's living standards were brought up in an enormous way.
And got the IMF out too, right?
Yeah, that's right. They rejected the whole sort of IMF model of, you take out a loan with them, then they, get you to privatize water and, electricity and things like this. And it is, Rafael Correa himself refers to the period that not only he was in power, but the left in the whole region as the golden decade. So his party came out on top. They were hoping to win in the first round. They would have needed 40%. It looks, the votes are still being counted, but it looks like they didn't managed to reach that. They got around 32, 33%. So they'll go into a second sort of runoff. We don't know who's going to be yet. There's two candidates in the likely to go into
would
that
the
runoff.
runoff only have a total of two candidates?
Yeah, two candidates, that's right. It's either a guy called Guillermo Lasso, who is one of the most prominent bankers in the country. He served in previous governments in the 80s and 90s during the worst periods of economic collapse in Ecuador. Part of why there's millions of Ecuador is only a small country, but has millions of migrants in places like Spain and around South America, precisely because of this economic collapse that Guillermo Lasso presided over. Then you have another candidate who's quite interesting. Is a guy called Perez. He's a sort of liberal, indigenous candidate. He's been presented by certain sections of the Western media and sort of liberal sections of the Western media as a sort of left alternative to Correa, to the so-called left authoritarianism, as they like to characterize the left in Latin America. But in reality, I think he can be defined as a liberal. He's someone who campaigned for Guillermo Lasso in the last elections, and Guillermo Lasso himself has said that in the case of if Yaku Perez is the second place candidate, that Guillermo Lasso said that he will endorse him. So he has this backing of this sort of elite banking class in Ecuador. So the Correista left is saying that we're up against two candidates of continuation of the current government that has, indebted the country under hundreds of millions of dollars of IMF debt, which is going to be extremely difficult to pay off, much of it illegitimate. So it's quite an interesting situation. We don't know who's going to go in yet, whether it'll be Lasso or Yaku Perez. At the moment, Lasso is on 19.6% and Yaku Perez on 19.8%. And there's still about 2% of votes still left to count. So it's going to be quite a heated runoff.
And there was reporting on like lines for voting just that were like hours long. I know Ben Norton was covering that. So has anyone been saying why that happened?
Yeah, it's awful. People are out there for numerous hours. A lot of Ecuador is on the coast, which is tremendously hot, humid. And actually, is the law in Ecuador, voting is obligatory. You have to vote by law. And if you don't vote, you get fined. However, when these big lines started to emerge, the electoral council said, oh, we're not going to be collecting the fines for those people who don't vote. So there's a clear sort of trying to get people to, if you're a bit tired, why don't you just, go home, have some lunch, whatever. And obviously, I think there's a lot of, debate that each country can have about whether to make voting obligatory. But I think the tendency in every country is when voting is obligatory as actually something that benefits the left, because who are the people that wouldn't vote? Otherwise, it's those who feel most disenfranchised, those who are more likely to vote for the left. So that was a clear strategy. Yeah, certainly foul play.
And do you know anything more about? Didn't Lenin Moreno come to Washington D.C. and meet with the Biden administration in the days leading up to the election, and what that was about?
Yeah, and in the week leading up to the election, of course, none of that information is particularly public.
Right.
They just posted. I think he himself posted a photo on Twitter with Luis Almagro, who's the head of the OAS, just saying that, we discussed about how we can strengthen democracy in Latin America, etc.
Right.
And this is a president who jailed and forced into exile all of the leaders of what is now the largest party in the country. Correa himself wanted to be the vice presidential candidate. He was banned. He's currently in exile, as were most. Andres Arauz, the candidate of the left, he himself was in exile for a short while in Mexico, and he actually wasn't able to vote for himself on Sunday because his residence was still in Mexico. So Lenin Moreno cannot be characterized as a figure of democracy, but I think that doesn't seem to matter to the sort of U.S. foreign policy elite.
Right. It seems like that Moreno and the U.S. have done everything they can to make sure that Correa's party is, has to flee the country. Is they brought basically false charges against him. Everything they can do to just try and make sure the socialist candidate does not win.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's clearly a project that failed. Just like in Bolivia, they thought that by jailing a few leaders, the whole organization would sort of disappear. But the reality is that Correísmo, or like the MAS in Bolivia, it's a movement. It's a movement that exists in every single region of the country. And just because you take out a few leaders, new ones spring up. Andrés Arauz is very young. He's in his late 30s, if I'm correct, around that age. So yeah, they haven't been able to stop that process. And at the end of the day, the forces, Correa's party, have a very strong argument, a simple argument, that is simply people's living standards were higher when he was in government compared to what they are now under the sort of IMF-led government, in which there's mass unemployment, sharp rise in poverty. And I remember I used to live in Ecuador. I used to work in Ecuador just over a year ago. And, everyone I would speak to who supported Correa, people at the market, or maybe they run a small restaurant, they would always state their support in quite like unideological terms. There's not people who could be, they haven't read every single volume of Capital. They would just say, no, things are terrible now. There's no jobs. There's crime everywhere. Things are just falling apart. And before, it was way better. So it's however much media spin there is, and there has been a huge and aggressive media campaign against Correa, they can't delete that simple fact from people's minds. People have lived it. It was only 4 years ago. So when propaganda runs up against people's, real life experiences, it tends to sort of dissolve.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, I guess there'll be a lot of propaganda and a lot of spin going into this runoff election. Whoever Arauz is up against, I'm sure the U.S. is not done trying to make sure Arauz does not win this thing.
Oh yeah, there's been all sorts of absurd sort of media campaigns. A few years ago, there was an allegation in the media that Correa's party is being funded by the FARC in Colombia, which is a sort of armed group. And, we're going to bring charges about this. Since then, nothing's been said. Nothing. It's just sort of dropped by the wayside. And now, I think 2 weeks before the election, this time, they said, oh no, they're being funded by the ELN, which is another armed group in Colombia. So, of course, again, no evidence presented. It'll likely end up like the first allegation, just sort of forgotten about within a few months' time when its use has been made redundant. But it's incredible. There's not a single private media outlet that has an editorial line sympathetic or at least not incredibly aggressively against the Correísta forces. So I think it's an impressive achievement to be the largest party in the country, despite having zero space or representation in the media.
Yeah, without the media oligarchs on your side. Are you in Bolivia? Is that right?
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
How are things going there? The last country to the latest country before Ecuador to vote out the U.S. backed coup leaders.
Yeah, it feels good. I mean, this time last year was the height of the sort of persecution. Where I'm speaking to you from now is the officers of a radio station that I work at. And this time last year, there were threats that they were going to seize the offices. We were leaked audios from internal government meetings discussing how they're going to do this. We had to ask the local community to sort of form a vigil around the office to protect it. The people there day and night. I remember in this region, it's called the Tropic of Cochabamba, is the strongest base of support for the MAS. Some other things happened here. People here that were massacred when the coup was taking place. 11 people were killed. But also, as a punishment for being the strongest base of support for the MAS, there was a number of measures of collective punishment. So on at least 3 occasions, I remember, they cut off all access to banks. We couldn't withdraw money from ATMs.
Really?
Whatever cash you had, that's what you had. And that was in punishment because the local community actually expelled the police after the coup. People sort of surrounded the police stations, throwing stones, and the police had to escape. And as punishment for that, they said, okay, no, you can't have any banks. They cut off the supply of fuel. There was no, public transport was just incredibly difficult. But now, there's an era of freedom. The challenges are huge. I mean, the last government in Bolivia left, an enormous debt with the IMF. So the economic recovery is going to take quite a long time. The extent of the damage done by the neoliberal reforms, the privatization of certain state industries, or the paralyzation of big development projects has completely destroyed the economy, and it's going to take a very long time to get out of that. But there is a president, Luis Arce, like Andrés Arauz in Ecuador. They're actually economists. I know in Europe and North America, I think there's not enough economists on the left, because it's something incredibly important to think about how you're going to build an economy, a post-neoliberal economy, an economy that can meet people's needs, an economy in which the government has the power to mobilize certain sections of the economy to meet certain needs. I think it's something to keep an eye on, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, watching from afar and obviously knowing less of the play-by-play, it was still miraculous to see what happened in Bolivia. I mean, going up against U.S.-backed forces, going up against factions of the military, and yet you guys were still able to have a legitimate election and get rid of the U.S.-backed neoliberal coup. I mean, it also goes to show how much more legit I feel the elections are in some of these Central and South American countries than they are in the U.S.
Well, I think it wasn't a given that there were going to be legitimate elections in Bolivia. There were a lot of signs that there was going to be a lot of foul play. But I think a factor in achieving those fair elections was the fact that there was a huge popular uprising, a general strike a few months before in August, when they kept trying to delay the elections using COVID as an excuse, saying, we can't hold the election, push it back. They did this 3 times. And the 3rd time, people said, no, like this is just an excuse. You're just going to delay it again when we get to the new date. And there was a general strike right across the country. All the highways along here completely blockaded. People built barricades and sort of encroaching in on the cities. It was a total paralyzation of the country. And the demand began as, we want elections. We want free elections. I think after 2 days of this, the demand changed to, we want the whole government out, and we're not going to lift this until the whole government is gone. And actually, Evo Morales himself intervened in this debate and said, no, if we go for this option, this sort of violent overthrow, how many lives is that going to cost? If we've still got a chance of going down the democratic route, we should try and take it while it's still there. If we can force them to do elections, that will be worth it, and we're going to win. And that's how things played out. The government realized that they couldn't manipulate the election. If they tried, there'd be an even bigger uprising. So they were backed into the corner, and they had to hold a free election. So I think it's in any country, in the US or anywhere in Latin America, these things depend on the power of ordinary people to scare the elites. Yeah.
I've also seen you've done reporting on Venezuela, another country that has fought off U.S. attempted or U.S.-backed attempted coups. And I was wondering what updates you have there. I know that Juan Guaido's power continues to fade into oblivion.
Yeah, he's become the sort of running joke of Latin America, a guy who's declared himself president in the street, like at a protest. But at the time, it was very serious. I mean, at the time, I remember I was working in Ecuador at the time, and we were getting these reports coming in about opposition protests, and we thought, well, there's always these sorts of things. But then the fact that the US government under Donald Trump actually took the step of recognizing this sort of fantasy president was very serious.
Along with our entire Democratic side as well.
Oh yeah, of course, as well as the EU, as well as governments like the UK, etc. Um, and that was quite serious radicalization of the attacks on Venezuela. Because what did that mean? I mean, one, they no longer were doing business with the state oil company, PDVSA, and PDVSA actually has a company within the US called Citgo, which is the sort of US subsidiary where they manage the affairs in the US.
Right.
And even though Obama was the person who introduced the sanctions and launched numerous attacks on Venezuela. However, during that time, the US always bought Venezuelan oil, and that was something that was an income for the Venezuelan people. So the step of actually recognizing Juan Guaido caused just cut off that multi-billion-dollar company Citgo. They seized control of it, gave it to this guy Juan Guaido. And the effect, the price was paid by the Venezuelan people. The little money the government had to provide food, medicines, etc., was suddenly cut off. So we can see the sort of cruelty of this policy. If they want to try and change a government via the means that they normally do, funding right-wing groups, etc., that would be one thing. But to lay siege to an entire population, a sort of medieval war tactic, it's just a sign of pure cruelty. And if their aim is to overthrow the government, they clearly haven't achieved that. So why do they keep this up? It's to make people suffer.
Yeah, the economic sanctions, the economic war that's gone along with recognizing Guaido, it's just been horrific. And, the tens of thousands have died. And of course, the ones that die from that, the quickest and most easiest are going to be infants and elderly people. And so really that's who this is a war on. I mean, it's just horrific.
Yeah, and with the pandemic is shown the worst side of this. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was the Jack Ma Foundation, the charity owned by that Chinese billionaire, and they were sending sort of COVID aid, protective suits, etc., to various countries. And they had a shipment ready to go out from Venezuela. However, the company that was supposed to transport it was a US company, and they said, "Sorry, we don't want to get fined by the US government, so we can't take this." So the first few months of the pandemic, Venezuela was, without a lot of the supplies that they would have needed. And it was an incredibly difficult situation. And it's something that's been done to Cuba. It's something they're trying to do in Nicaragua. And I think the message from these countries would just be, if you oppose us, that's one thing, but don't make the entire population pay the price. Because if a country can't, for example, process bank payments, if a country can't accept money from Western Union, say, an ordinary family in Cuba or Venezuela, if they can't have relatives abroad send them money via Western Union, then that's money for food, that's money for medicines that suddenly disappeared. Why does that need to happen?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let you go here in a minute. I want to use up all your time, but is there anything else people should know in the lead up to this runoff, which I think is in April, right?
Yeah, it'll be in a couple of months. I just think it's important to keep an eye on what's going on in Latin America, because I think what's being built, particularly people like Andrés Arauz, Luis Arce, left-wing economists, they are, I think, going to build something that could resemble economies of the future. I think leftists in the US or Europe, Canada, etc., could look at some of what they're doing and incorporate that into certain demands, into programs about how you can build an economy based on human need rather than profit. So I think it's incredibly important to keep an eye out. Just plug myself. I mean, my outlet is
please.
An outlet that we've set up here at the radio is Calsatra News, which we're doing to sort of provide an English language service about what's going on. And we're going to be next couple of weeks launching a website and sort of expanding a bit. So we hope to be able to deliver that and have that exchange. I hope that people can take some of that information and think about their own countries. Oh, if they do that there, can we do that here? Or if that went wrong there, then what does that mean for us here? It's that exchange, I think, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad to hear you're expanding and everything. Your voice is much needed, and you do excellent work. For Americans, it's probably easiest to follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter again?
Yeah, O Vargas 52 on Twitter. That's my personal. And the project that we set up is at Calsatrian News. Something I'm doing with another great journalist, Camila Escalante. Some of your viewers may know her. She's also here reporting on Latin America in English. She's at Prensa Camila. So yeah, I think these are exciting times, and we have a lot, going on before we launch this. But hopefully, once it's off the ground, it will grow wings.
Thank you so much, Ollie. It's an honor to finally meet you.
No, thank you. It's been a great interview. Thank you for having me on.
All right, talk soon.
Thank you.
Well, guys, that was Ollie Vargas. Definitely follow him. If you have trouble finding his Twitter, just go to my Twitter, and I've retweeted him recently. So that's at Lee Camp, and you can find his Twitter there. I'll give you. I want to go into another story here real quick before we wrap up, and also if you have any questions you're aching to ask, feel free to throw them in the comment thread. Please, obviously, share this and let people know. I'm doing this live stream. I believe it's. Oh no, it didn't. It's not. This one's not going on live on Rockfin, but normally I'm doing more videos on Rockfin as well. That's rockfin.com/Lee Camp, because we're slowly trying to move away from YouTube, which suppresses us so much. But yeah, I wanted to, and obviously what I was talking about with Ollie there, fucking exciting times. I mean, it is true that despite all of the U.S. efforts and U.S.-backed efforts and the bankers' efforts, and literally the guy fucking running against Arauz is a banker, is one of the top bankers in Ecuador. Despite all of their efforts, the fact they own the media, the fact they have so much money, it did not stop Andres Arauz from winning this first round of this election. And obviously, that type of tenacity and effort and people working hard will have to continue into this runoff, or the IMF banker motherfuckers could still win. That could still happen, but for now, this was a huge victory. And yeah, it's happening in other countries as well. Bolivia, Venezuela has continued to fight off their U.S.-backed coup. I mean, it's like playing fucking whack-a-mole, where you're like, oh, there's a U.S.-backed coup over there. U.S.-backed coup over there. God damn it, they're fucking popping up everywhere, because they never fucking stop. These assholes. They billions of dollars to just throw at just fucking destroying countries. Mainly a lot of these are smaller countries. They've got 10, 20 million people, and we're like, yeah, let's just fucking make their lives hell so that we can own a little bit more of the world. I mean, it's just so amazingly fucked. But as we're seeing, there's a lot of victories to remember and to focus on. I wanted to cover one other story before I wrap this up. And this is it's a New York Times article, and perhaps kind of some of the most telling articles is when the New York Times or mainstream media is covering something that you're kind of like, oh, I'm glad they're talking about that. That's some of the most telling times, because despite the fact that they're covering something that you're glad they're talking about, that you think is important, they still manage to kind of miss the root of it all, miss the actual heart of the story. And I think this is a perfect example of that. So let's see, share this screen with you. This is the New York Times, and they're covering, like I said, an important story. This is about how tough homeless people have it right now. It's titled the subway was their refuge on cold nights. Now it's off limits. This has to do with the reason it's off limits is because of the pandemic, and Cuomo's I get initially why he said, oh, well, let's close down the subway overnight so that they can all be deep cleaned. And that made sense when we didn't know much about the virus. But we now know that it's very rarely spread on surfaces. Far more likely it is spread person to person, usually people not wearing masks. So the whole idea of let's close down the subway at night so that it can be deep cleaned doesn't really seem to make sense anymore. But good to know, still destroys homeless people's lives. So at least we got that going. But the article goes into, these people's lives, and, New York City's homeless population has faced a particularly brutal winter as coronavirus restrictions have kept the subway and other indoor public spaces closed. And it really is like a gut-wrenching story. I mean, they go through the daily routine of some of these homeless people who either don't want to go to shelters or because there's a lot of reasons to not go to shelters. Sometimes you have to have appropriate paperwork. Sometimes you can't bring, like, let's say, a dog if there's homeless people with pets. Sometimes it could be that your shit is stolen. There's sexual harassment. So there's various reasons that people might not want to go to these overcrowded, which again in a pandemic, overcrowded shelters. And so some of them choose to try and get by in other places in New York City. I lived there for 12 years, and sometimes they'll just ride the train all night long, and they'll fall asleep in the corner or whatever. And it's very common on trains. When I was on there at midnight a lot of times because I was going to the comedy clubs and stuff, and you would see a person who's sleeping there. And the New York Times, like I said, the positive of this story is the New York Times has decided to give a fuck that the homeless people now don't have that ability to sleep on the trains, and they're getting kicked out of other areas they used to sleep too, like the Port Authority and other areas where they could stay warm. And so they've started, New York City has been just booting them out of these places. The article also covers that there are certain teams of helpers. I don't know I can't remember what they called them, homeless care people that are at the train stations, that rather than just kick them off and say, get into the night, fucking go freeze to death, they try and take them to somewhere where they could be in a shelter or something. But here's the thing that the New York Times will not mention, despite digging into this story, despite digging into these people's lives, is there is no fucking reason this needs to be reality. There is no fucking reason that people should be homeless in the richest country in the world at all. There's no fucking reason that we can't give every single person some sort of shelter, some sort of nutritional meals, some sort of clothing that is appropriate. Like, it should just be covered. It is outlandish in this goddamn country that people are sleeping on the trains, that people are sleeping out on the streets in negative temperatures. It's fucking insane. And the New York Times doesn't say that, right? And by not saying that, you read this article and you think, this is bad. I don't like these people are homeless, but at least the city of New York has these people trying to help them out, trying to show them where a shelter is. At least the New York Times is talking about this story. But why aren't we getting to the heart of it? Why aren't we talking about how this is the end result of capitalism? Always. There are always going to be people churned up by this system and spit out onto the street, either because they're not mentally capable of holding down a job, or because they're just very independent minded, and they were like, you know what, the wage slavery thing is not really for me, or they could be self-medicating with addiction problems. There's numerous reasons, but all of them at the heart are like, yeah, capitalism fucking sucks. It sucks for so many people. And, I of course, many of the people who do have a roof over their heads and can afford clothes and everything, they still have to give their formative years, many of their most productive years of their lives away to jobs they fucking hate. How is that a reasonable system? How is that the way life should work? It's fucking not. And none of this can be, what's so infuriating is none of this can be mentioned in the New York Times. They sit there, they'll do 1,000-word articles. I mean, this is a pretty extensive article. They'll do fucking long-ass articles and never get to the actual heart of the problem. Never. So these are the helper people, whatever the fuck they're called, homeless outreach. Okay, homeless outreach people, which I'm glad they have something. But guess what? Rather than funding the homeless outreach people, every homeless person should have an apartment. Should have their own apartment. And in fact, they did that in Salt Lake City and in Utah. They gave every homeless person an apartment, and they gave them a caseworker, a social worker, to try and help them for chronically homeless people. And it decreased homelessness by 95%. So then Utah looked at that and they said, oh, and it saved the money, by the way, too. It actually cost the state less than having people on the streets, because the people on the streets needed, health care and things like that more often. They were more often having problems. They were arrested more often. So it saved the money and gave everyone an apartment and a caseworker. And obviously that's not going to solve everybody's life issues, but it fucking helped a lot, and it decreased homelessness by 95%. So Utah looked at that and then said, wow, we have decreased homelessness by 95%. We better stop this program. We need to get rid of this program. And so they scrapped it. And now their homelessness has gone back up. So we found the solution. I mean, honestly, it's amazing how often we find the answer to our problems and then we go, well, let's fucking run away from that. We run faster away from solutions to problems than, as if it's like a beehive filled with bees that want to audit you. Like accountant bees that want to go through your tax records. We fucking sprint away whenever we have the answer to these problems, because the answers are anti-capitalist. They go against the capitalist system. And it's the threat of the good example. If people look at this and they go, wow, that's the answer there. We solved homelessness. But it doesn't fit with capitalism. It doesn't fit with profit over all else. And so then we scrap those ideas. And you see this again and again. You see it with tiny homes being crushed by police forces. You see it with the homeless people being arrested for, camping out somewhere. You just see it again and again. We know the solutions, and we fucking don't do them because it doesn't fit with profit over all else. It doesn't fit with our capitalist death spiral we're on. That is destroying the environment, destroying people's lives. People love to say, oh, look at how many people capitalism has helped. And it's like, capitalism has killed hundreds of millions if you look at the fact that we have exploited so many nations, and now like millions die every year from preventable diseases because America, the West, Europe, basically the quote unquote first world countries are using all of the resources, all the wealth, and leaving others to just die. And people die of, kids die of diarrhea, like regularly every day, thousands. Dirty water is one of the top causes of death around this world. And so capitalism has killed hundreds of millions, but for those it's, risen up or helped, most of that has to do more with gaining of wealth, which you could have done without capitalism. You can produce things and have like abundance without it being about exploitation. And it's about technology. Technology has helped billions of people. But we act like technology couldn't exist without capitalism. That's bullshit. In fact, technology would likely be progress much quicker without capitalism, because then you'd have everyone working together as opposed to corporations designing things in their little silo and trying to fend off anybody else having any knowledge of what they're working on, how they're doing it. Whereas, and then also there's toxic nationalism as well, getting in the way of the growth of technology. Imagine if every country were working together on all of our problems, such as climate change. You would have progress much quicker. But anyway, Layla says technology doesn't mean progress. It certainly does not always mean progress, but technology causes the most harm when it's owned and used by fascist governments, by fucking sociopaths that at the top of our systems, which capitalism uniquely puts sociopaths at the top of our systems. It finds the sociopaths. It says, wow, you're really willing to fucking stand on the throat of everybody else to get ahead. That makes you great in this corporate setting. We will put you to the top of the system. So you have systems run by sociopaths. And same with politicians, corporate boardrooms, politicians. Most of them get ahead by being sociopaths, by having little to no empathy for others. And when technology is owned by those motherfuckers, then it ends up being used for bad purposes. But technology in and of itself is a tool that could be used for good and could be used for harm. Obviously, even despite this, much technology is still used for good, but all right, I'm going to wrap it up here in a second. I really appreciate you guys joining me, and I would love for you. Thank you, Juan. Juan's from Ecuador, and he says, thank you for covering Ecuador. Appreciate it. Everybody check out Ollie Vargas. The latest episode of Government Secrets is out on the podcast platforms with JFK assassination coverage, part 3. We're going to do a part 4, I think, next week. And it may this series covering the JFK assassination has likely played a role. I don't think it was solely responsible, but played a role in Graham Elwood being demonetized, which I don't like that happened, but I also understand that if you're going to cover the most important stuff in the world, in the nation's history, then they're going to come after you. That's how this works. But anyway, Graham and I are both at Rockfin, ROKFIN.com/Lee Camp. Please head over there, check it out. And also check out all my stuff at LeeCamp.com. I appreciate it. I hope you take a minute to share this video with people, let people know. And I do these every single weekday, except sometimes. So go to LeeCamp.com in order to learn about each new video. Keep fighting.